recording. Now we're recording. Um, and then so the third reason then is helping to create like a basis for meaning in our lives, right? So I think a lot of people sort of struggle with meaning, right? There's the whole like nihilism, existentialism kind of phase that kids go through. Tanuj definitely knows what I'm talking about. I'm sure a lot of other people do as well. In high school, there's sort of or teenage years in general, I think there's sort of this phase that a lot of people go through where it's like, where does meaning come from? Like, why do I exist as a person? And I think ultimately the realization that people have is that you just have to like some kind of like basis, right? Like you have to assume some kind of set of axioms on top of which you build the rest of your ideology, the rest of the way you go about life. And I think Indian philosophy is a good way to go about constructing that kind of narrative or that context for how you want to go about living your life, your intellectual life, etc. And then finally, sort of from a meta perspective, is to reconstruct like an interpretation of Indian philosophy that I think is conducive to societal flourishing. And this is definitely more of like my opinion. Obviously I'm teaching this class, so I'm sort of going to be like pushing this like my ideas on you. But like I will clearly say that like this is much more my opinion than it is like objective fact. So like one point of view that I have is that like I think material productivity and like Darwinism is something that is like fundamentally important to us as like living beings. And I think that we should go about actively creating cultures that are conducive to that kind of material productivity. So when I say societal flourishing here, I really mean long-term material productivity. So religion or culture serves to socialize individuals, right, and increase social cohesion. If religion just told people like for example, if we take Christianity and Judaism, you have like the 10 commandments, which are like do not steal, etc., 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 do not kill. Those basically serve to ensure that like society maintains stability. And why is Christianity so successful? One reason we could say is that like Darwinistically, it creates societies that replicate themselves more effectively. So this is like the whole memes idea of Richard Dawkins. So if some of you guys might know that the term meme now means internet memes, but it was really introduced by Richard Dawkins, where he came up with this idea that cultures, like cultural traits and intellectual ideas, can replicate themselves, and you can study cultural ideas or memes similarly to the way you study genes, and Darwinistic forces act upon them as well. So my point here is that we might want to go about constructing a religion or culture that is like Darwinistically successful. And so this line over here, Hinduism today is broken in many ways. That might be inflammatory to a lot of people, but like I think it's true. I think there's a lot of problems with Hinduism in the sense that it's in the way it's practiced today, and in the sense that it encourages like superstition in some senses. It doesn't provide the social cohesion. Sometimes, like many Indian families will go to the temple like once every month or something, and there's no sense of community there, right? So that is a huge component of religion that I think is left out. And at the bottom over here, I just have this sort of broad kind of flow chart, right? That philosophy influences religion, which influences the way that people act via culture, and then you have societal outcomes that come from the way people act. So if we play around with philosophy, we have this ability to participate in the way that society will be organized in maybe like decades or hundreds of years. So that's another reason why Indian philosophy is super exciting to me. And we're uniquely poised, right? In that like India is a rapidly growing country right now. We're uniquely poised in the early 21st century to be part of a intellectual growth or change in India that we haven't seen for like for centuries, right? So that's like another kind of interesting place that I think we find ourselves in as sort of the intellectual class of the like an India, finding ourselves as an intellectual class that can actively mold the way Indian society is organized. So yeah, these are broadly the reasons I'm interested in Indian philosophy. So any questions or challenges here? I think the way I want to run this class is to like actively encourage you to challenge me. I definitely said some inflammatory stuff. Does anyone have issues with anything I said? I'm sure you do, but like it's just a matter of like voicing your opinion. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to raise a point. You had mentioned like the lack of community, and that tends to come with like more modern day Hinduism. But I think that depends on where you're looking at it from, because like I think in the US, the way Hinduism is practiced is different from in India, and in India, it's different in different states, and it's like such a diverse like community of people practicing it. So I feel like it's a bit of a broad statement, but I do see where you're coming from.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think Hinduism is very diverse in the way different people practice it is all kinds of different. Um, but I think still broadly, if you look at the centralization, like the emphasis on social centralization that you have with like Protestant churches in Northern Europe, it's very like societal cohesion focused. Whereas even when you go to temples in India, everyone's just sort of shuffling past the idol, right, to like do their darshan and then like keep walking. So I think that is a I totally see what you're saying, and I'm sure there's certain sects of Hinduism where there is a lot more social cohesion, but yeah. Tanuj?
So when we're going to be talking about Hinduism in this class, are we going to be specifically focusing on just the religion aspect of it? Because I feel like a lot of time when we talk about Hinduism in India specifically, it encompasses a lot of, the cultural things associated with, the people who live there.
This is a wonderful question. So we'll be talking about the very blurry borders between religion and culture in just a few slides. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we'll talk about it soon. Nathan?
What do you mean by I want you to elaborate a little bit. Like, you're talking about memetics. Do you mean like we need to like have a memetic perspective about religion and philosophy generally to like better ground ourselves and like see why things are happening the way they are? Or do you mean like, I'm sure you don't mean this, but like we need to like manually change all the ideas to make them more like appealing to people,
So I think that definitely the first thing I would agree with. I think it's very important to take like a mimetic or Darwinistic kind of perspective on the reason that religions evolve and cultures evolve the way they do. But at the same time, we want to make sure that if we do want to go about constructing a philosophy or a culture that is conducive to success, it also needs to be Darwinistically like successful, right? Like, what is the point of constructing this grand philosophical framework if no one actually comes to use it? So I guess that's my point with bringing up Darwinism and memetics.
Okay.
Cool. Mari?
Not really a question, but I was just wondering what your take on like the coming newer generations leaning further away from Christianity than have in the past, and also, actually, I just lost my train of thought. How I'll let you answer that first part, and I'll think
Sure.
of the second.
I guess I don't have too big of an opinion on it. I will say that I do think a component of the reason why so many teenagers today lack meaning or a sense of like grounding or direction in life is maybe the loss of religion. Though obviously I don't have like psychological studies to back this up. I'm not like a sociology expert, but I do think that religion provides like a sort of base upon which you can build your direction in life. And maybe there's something to be said about like the loss of Christianity in the U.S. with respect to that.
And I remembered what the second part was. It was what I just wanted to clarify what your definition of like a successful philosophy or like culture sort of is. 'Cause I'm sort of getting the message of like propagation, but also like how it creates community. So I don't know if you could elaborate on your thoughts.
Yeah, so we'll definitely talk about this more in the future as well, but like a huge component for me is like material productivity. So this is very different from what a lot of people might stereotype Indian philosophy as, right? Most people see Hinduism and like generally Eastern philosophy as very immaterial. But I think material productivity is a huge component of like it's fundamentally necessary for a society to exist, right? You need to be able to produce food, you need to be able to produce basic goods and items. So I have a sort of grand vision of like Darwinism and whatnot. But I think that in order to I don't want to go into the details, but basically I mean material productivity. That's one of the major things that I'd optimize for when we're going about constructing like a philosophical framework. Chris?
So I just have two questions. So one is, I guess, so like, do you agree with the statement that that I guess like religious people like atheists and agnostics and whatnot are not able to like produce meaning in their lives? And if not, then do you think that like an atheist's way of like atheists attempt to create meaning in their lives is any less valid or like less structured than like a religious person, like a Hindu or a Christian?
This is a wonderful question, and in many ways, I would consider myself an atheist, which might come as a surprise to some of you, but it is much more complicated than that. But I think that I would generally say I completely disagree with that statement. I think people are totally capable of generating meaning. As an atheist, you're completely capable of generating meaning in the sense that you can take on any arbitrary axiom or something, right? Like you could say like eating oranges is the purpose of life, and you can take that as like an axiom, and that doesn't require you to like believe in a god or anything, right? But like I will say that maybe a fully rational person isn't capable of generating meaning, because maybe we're definitely going to have this discussion in like several weeks, but we'll talk a lot about meaning. But yeah, very, very interesting question. Anything else on this slide?
Do you mind if I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you feel like I don't have like a Hindu background, but do you feel like the part of the reason Hinduism is broken is because there's sort of a divide between like the renunciate class of like practitioners and kind of the householders, and there's not really like a philosophical way to bridge that gap? So then you have like all of the deep understanding, it kind of gets pushed aside into like the renunciates who kind of practice in like far away, and then even like some of the priests aren't priests usually like householders in Hinduism. So that kind of like propagates itself where it's like a two parallel society instead of like a whole body, you know?
Yes, and this is very core to the problem in certain schools of philosophy that we're going to talk about later, specifically the Vedantin schools, in my opinion, that while on the one hand saying that the entire purpose of life is like moksha, right? Like release and like liberation, and the only way to do that is renunciation. At the same time, they demand that like 95% of the population produces material output for the top like 1 or 5% to be able to go about doing their like renunciate activities. And I think that's a huge problem. And I think it's pretty unfair to do something like that, right? Because it's very double speaky, and I think it's also sort of non-conducive to material productivity, because if you're telling everyone that you're not supposed to have liberation in this lifetime, you're supposed to produce material for the people who get to have liberation in this lifetime, then like what stops the people from just being like, okay, but what if I don't want to produce material goods? Like, let me just go become a renunciate too. And then you have everyone becoming renunciates, and like, where's your economy now, right? So obviously that's like a huge extrapolation, but I think you have highlighted a very specific problem that we're probably going to talk about in, I want to say, week 8. But yeah, very interesting. Cool. Anything else on this slide? I think we should, yeah, definitely be moving on. It's 7:30 now. Cool. All right, so learning objectives. I already sort of talked a bit about these while I was going over my own sort of introduction. One of them is deepening your critical thinking skills by engaging with like complex and exotic ideas spanning logic, language, and metaphysics. Basically what that means is there are some very exotic approaches to language, very exotic approaches to logic in Indian philosophy. For example, some of the CS or engineering people here, or philosophy people, might have taken intuitionistic logic, which is basically frameworks of logic without the law of the excluded middle, which is basically saying that double negation does not equal, like double negatives doesn't equal a positive. So the law of the excluded middle says 2 negatives does not equal a positive. And it's sort of a new idea in Western logic that arose in the 20th century. But in Indian philosophy, there's actually intuitionistic logic going back to around the 4th century AD with the Buddhist schools. So there's very cool ideas there. With language, there's like exotic ideas in terms of recursive finite state machines in like the 4th century BC that are being used to describe like grammatical features of Sanskrit. And then metaphysics, there's all of like the sort of intellectual circle jerk of like Vedanta in like the 1100s with like the non-duality versus like qualified non-duality, et cetera, that we'll talk about at some point. Develop the fundamentals necessary for deeper study, right? So this is a very high level course. It might seem like we're going very deep, but there's like entire like journals of academia where they basically focus on very deep problems in this field. So this course will hopefully prepare you to be able to interface with those. Also learning how to construct an intellectual or ideological identity informed by your cultural, ethnic, and ancestral context. Basically, that means like what I was sort of saying on the previous slide, like sort of constructing a philosophical framework that is conducive to the values that like I care about, i.e. like material productivity and a lot of the other things I mentioned. I want you guys to be able to do the same things with your own sort of like context, right? Because I personally think that constructing an identity based on something that is like fundamentally you, right? Your like genetics, your ethnic and ancestral context. I think that provides like a lot of meaning in a way that certain other ways of constructing meaning just aren't as fulfilling. Or at least that's the way I personally feel. So being able to construct that meaning, that identity in your life, I think is also a huge component I want you guys to be able to do with this course. And then also gain an appreciation for the logical sophistication and rich history of non-Western intellectual traditions, namely those of the Indian subcontinent. Basically showing that like the Western intellectual tradition isn't the only one, as we're often like taught in schools in the US. There's a whole other like very, very advanced like tradition of intellectualism in Asia, India, China, etc. Cool. So now, what is philosophy? What is philosophy? I'm going to open it up for discussion here a lot. So we'll have a few of these slides asking like, what is philosophy? What is like history, etc. And I'd love to hear like your guys' answers. So like, what does philosophy mean to you? Like when I say the word philosophy, like what comes to mind to you guys? Feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to just like shout it out. There's a lot of correct answers. Oh, oops. There's a lot of correct answers. So please do go ahead. Milo?
I like the way that we ask about the world around us, that we answer those questions.
Yeah, definitely like a process of questioning. I think that's a good way of putting it. Someone else?
I'd say it generally has to do a lot with knowledge of like the self or like what's going on inside your own head. I know it's not exclusively about that, but that's a big part of it.
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. I think a huge component of philosophy is definitely questions about self, and one of our lectures is going to be entirely about self. Yeah, I think someone said in the chat, thinking about thinking. That's sort of a good way of putting it, or alternatively, like thinking or like knowledge is like an ends rather than a mean, right? What constitutes a just society and an individual's purpose? Yeah, so that like delineates a few kind of important parts of philosophy, like politics and ethics, like political philosophy, ethics, right? Omer?
I think a big part of philosophy is taking the same problems that every single human being experiences, no matter the person they are, and utilizing certain philosophies as different ways of targeting the same issues. So applying moral and societal and all types of different principles that are umbrellaed by a type of philosophy, and using those to apply or to solve problems that we have, whether personal, societal, moral, etc.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And that's like what a lot of logic is about, right? If we can take a complex problem that a lot of people think about and then turn it into a logical statement that we can analyze with standard like logical formalisms, that's a great way to come to like a rational conclusion. Cool. So yeah, so let's look at like sort of the history of a term philosophy. I'm sure a lot of you have like heard in class like philosophia or whatever the fuck they say, right? It's like Greek for love of language or something like that. Sophistry, right? And like aquaphilia. What is it? What is the Greek root for water? Hydrophil. Yeah, like hydrophilic substances, right? Yeah. So that's what like philosophy is as etymology. We'll actually look at etymologies quite a bit in this course. I don't mean to like discard their importance. But yeah, it used to be a lot broader, right? It used to basically like the Greeks basically just used to mean it as like knowledge as an end rather than a means. And that's sort of like what we associate with like science now, right? So the Greeks sort of had this huge idea of it, like huge duality between like knowledge as a end in itself rather than like a means, right? So you can sort of say like science versus engineering is a similar kind of duality we have today. But more and more, there's this divide that came about of empiricism versus rationalism. So what that means is that empirical approaches to knowledge are ones that focus on actually going out into the world and observing data, interacting with the world, and using that to inform something about, like using that to learn about the way the world works. Whereas rationalism is more about using just raw reason, just like reason by itself. So for example, a very highly rational field would be like mathematics. And that's because all knowledge in mathematics is like a priori, which means that based on a few axioms in some abstract intellectual space, we come to all the answers automatically, like from those axioms, right? Whereas with empiricism, we have to go into the world, we have to collect data on like people's like average heights and then like do correlations with their like economic success, blah, blah, blah. And in the past couple centuries, empirical study has branched out of philosophy. So in the past, when the Greeks might have considered physics and biology and all of these as part of philosophy, now we consider these empirical studies as part of science and only the purely rational studies as philosophical. Yeah, science became like rigorously statistical, like took a rigorously statistical approach to empiricism in a lot of fields. And now what we have remaining is contemporary philosophy, which is basically this entirely like rational kind of like in the head philosophy. There's also this divide between like layman philosophy versus academic philosophy. Layman philosophy basically means like what people mean when they say my personal philosophy is that like you shouldn't harm anyone even if they harm you, blah blah blah, right? People have their own sort of broad kind of ideas about how they should go about living life, making decisions, etc., etc. Whereas academic philosophy is, in the modern sense, a lot more focused on the history of philosophy and the ways that ideas have come down to us, and generally like a more rigorous study of these ideas. So the world of philosophical traditions, these are sort of like the major like intellectually rigorous philosophical traditions that we know of today. There's the Western tradition, which sort of arose in the Enlightenment age from a synthesis between like the Greco-Romans and the Judeo-Christian philosophies, right? There's the Indian philosophical tradition, which has these two major schools as well, of like the Brahmanic, which we'll talk about, like, which is basically Hinduism, and then as well as the Shramanic schools like Buddhism and Jainism. And then there's the Chinese philosophical schools. They used to have a lot more philosophical schools, but then like the Qin dynasty like burned all the books, et cetera, et cetera. But their major two sort of like duality there is like the Confucians versus the Taoists. And they have, despite like common perceptions, they have like very differing kind of worldviews. And there's like the Islamic philosophical tradition, which actually pulls a lot from the Greek tradition, specifically Aristotle. History of Western philosophy, I don't want to go too much into depth in this. You guys probably have the general idea, but I just want to give you a general picture. Go about like 500 to like 300 AD. You have like the Greeks with all their Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They laid down a bunch of fundamental ideas and asked a lot of questions about what is the world, where does knowledge come from, what is logic, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have a lot of approaches to ethics and language that come out of like the Stoics. Then you have the medieval Christian philosophy, right? So Christianity appears on the European scene in the early few centuries AD, and then you have a lot of these medieval Christian philosophers, and it almost sort of like we now in the West sort of have this idea that the ancient Greek philosophy sort of like died, like it completely disappeared, but there's increasing evidence that that's not the case. And like Thomas Aquinas, for example, drew heavily on Aristotle. Then we have early modern philosophy in the 1500s and 1600s, where we have this increasing, like we like to think that there's this increasing kind of awareness of Greek philosophy, and you have the Renaissance, right? Descartes with his whole like mind-body problem, and they start dealing with a lot broader questions than were dealt with by the medieval Christian philosophers. So the medieval Christian philosophers cared a lot more about the relationship between God and soul and like righteous conduct, etc. Descartes starts asking a lot more questions that are sort of more abstract. Kant asks about like ethics. And you also have these kind of like blurred lines with politics, science, and math, right? So all these people over here, you might know them for accomplishments in politics or physics, but they consider themselves philosophers. And then you have contemporary Western philosophy, which is like the last 200-ish years. You have two major schools that it's like broken down into. You have the continental schools, you have like the continental and then the analytic. The continental is sort of a hodgepodge of a bunch of different kind of approaches. You obviously don't have to know these, but like to give you a broad overview of like what some of these ideas are, like phenomenology is the idea that like there is something raw and like non-linguistic about experience itself, and you can't put it into words. So like how do you go about like adequately studying like what it is like to taste a watermelon? Like what is it like? What is the phenomena of that? And then you have Hegel and Marx with their whole idea of like historical dialectic, which is actually like relevant in our discussion today. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard with their whole idea of existentialism, that you have to like construct meaning for yourself. You have the whole structuralist schools. Am I a philosophy? Oh yeah, I didn't tell you guys what my major was. I'm a cognitive science major actually. But yeah, sorry. Then you have the structuralists, which are they basically think that like all of society and all of language is underlined by like structures, and you can analyze language and culture in like similar ways. And then you have post-structuralism, where they basically say structures are like fake, or like we can tear down structures to create the structures that we want. It's very mind-bendy kind of stuff. Then you have critical theory, which you probably are more familiar with, that like you might have taken like freshman courses. And nowadays the continental school heavily intersects with social science, right? So a lot of these people have basically become sociologists, and they're taking philosophical kind of approaches to the ways that we deal with society as an individual, and vice versa. Then you have the analytic school. So the analytic schools are like, they're sort of perceived as being like a lot more rigorous, or at least they perceive themselves as being a lot more rigorous. I personally lean, I don't want to say anything about Western philosophy. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But basically they deal a lot more with logic and language and math. This is why our philosophy department at CMU is basically a math department. So like you guys might know this, our philosophy department is like dominated by like Steve Audi and the other guy who got like the $20 million in funding for like the formal math department. And some of you guys are like, why are they doing math in the philosophy department? Like this is like the intellectual kind of pedigree that traces itself from. So homotopy type theory, which is like Steve Audi's kind of like great accomplishment in the math department here, is actually an approach to formal logic that draws on like other fields of math, namely like category theory and type theory, and they're able to do like cool stuff in logic based on that. And that logical tradition goes back to Frege and Russell and Whitehead, who basically had this idea that maybe like we can completely delineate all the ideas in like the entirety of logic in like a book. And so they created this book called Principia Mathematica, and it's only about like 300 pages before you get to the proof that like 1 + 1 = 2. So it's like very rigorous kind of crazy stuff. And then yeah, you also have a lot of cognitive science in here thrown in. Yeah, cool stuff. Cool. So what is Indian philosophy not? This is I would open this for a discussion here, but like there's specifically some things that I want to talk about that Indian philosophy is not. Indian philosophy is not Hinduism. Indian philosophy is not Buddhism. Indian philosophy is not hand wavy in the air. Ooh, God, spirit. Oh, it's not om. It's not that. It's not reincarnation. Ooh, it's none of these things. It is a approach. It is a rigorous approach to answering questions in a philosophical style that has its own intellectual history going back thousands of years. There are indeed the woo people, but those are like a small segment that have grown increasingly prominent in the last like 500 to 1,000 years. And that sounds like a lot, but like it's small in respect to the rest of the history of Indian philosophy. Yeah, that's sort of something I wanted to clarify here, because like we go from like contemporary Western philosophy where it's like all like rigorous, and then we're gonna like jump to like an overview of Indian philosophy, and I want there to be a recognition that like these are indeed like rational approaches in similar ways that Indian philosophy is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Before we jump into this, yeah, Tanuj, or any other questions on Western philosophy? I just wanted to give like context on the Western tradition because we'll be drawing parallels when we're talking about the Indian tradition as well. Sorry, Tanuj.
You said a couple times you wanted to build, a framework for what goals you have in mind, and for you, you said material productivity, right? Was the big one for you?
Yeah.
So
yeah, go ahead.
What exactly does that mean in terms of, like, do you have to care what society is going to be like, 2 generations from now, or no? And if so, like, why? And is that rooted in religion?
Do I have to care, or should we care as people?
Like you're talking about material productivity, right? Does that mean you want the best and most goods for society right now or in your generation? Or do you have to care about like your children? And if so, why?
Yeah, so for me specifically, like I have like this very like Darwinistic kind of approach to this, and this also goes back to the idea of identity, right? So like I identify with like not my body, I identify with a broader sense of life or humanity. And a lot of people who say like, oh, I don't identify with myself, I identify with life, nature, blah blah blah. Let's be hippies. Let's go smoke weed in the woods. All is good. But I sort of ironically take like an orthodox or like a perpendicular orthogonal kind of assumption there, saying that if I identify with life and humanity as a whole, it then becomes my duty to ensure the progression of life, which is Darwinistic, and it always has been Darwinistic. Yeah, so that would be my answer. So like by taking this Darwinistic viewpoint, I think the rational conclusion is that like, yes, I would have to care about the fate of society several generations down the line.
To clarify, that means even if it means like sacrificing something for your own generation in order to better that for future ones, that would be
okay. Maybe yeah. Cool. Nathan?
So kind of building off of his question, you say you have a Darwinistic kind of approach to like philosophy generally. How do you ground your Darwinism in like more, how do you kind of break like the is-ought barrier? Because like from my understanding, Darwinism is a process that's always happening, and there's not really like a forward progression to it really. Like it just continues to adapt, and it's like how things balance out. So how do you kind of take that a step further and kind of bring it into like the philosophical realm?
So like, for example, I think the Enlightenment and the rise of Western capitalism is a great example of bringing Darwinism forward, right? So whereas previously you would have had Darwinism on an entirely force-based, non-voluntary basis, where you'd have kings going around and like literally slaughtering each other in order to expand their territory, capitalism is a step of Darwinism in the direction of more intellectual or cooperative Darwinism, right? So it's basically a manifestation of Darwinism where people can come together to generate value, while at the same time Darwinistic forces are at play which decide allocation of material goods and value. That's sort of what I mean by this. And I don't want to leave like other people out of the discussion and like go like too big on this tangent, but like like did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it helps. I still have questions, but
yeah, no, we can definitely talk more about like capitalism and like Darwinism like after class if you want.
Okay.
Cool. And then I think I saw one other hand raised. I'm not sure. Okay, cool. Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I just didn't want to take too much of your time, but this is a very quick question. So do you think that like Indian philosophy could could get like as analytical as like, for example, I see like Russell, like I know like in like one of his papers he spent like over 80 pages just to build up to like 1 + 1 = 2, and like it's like extremely like as rigorous as you can get. Like how rigorous does like Indian philosophy get, would you say?
Okay, so like I don't want to flex. Wait. Okay, wait. So look over here. I have wait here. I'm just gonna pull something up. Can you guys like see this right now? So this is a web viewer of a traditional Indian approach to grammar developed in like the 4th century BC. These are entirely algorithmically generated words. So for example, here you have the word spadhate, which means I actually have no idea what this word means. It means he challenges. So this is like the present tense, okay? And over here you basically have the word spadhate, and here you have a list of rules, literally sutras and citations for the sutras that are used to derive the exact form that we see here. So you have like the root spud, and then you have all these rules that are applied upon it. And after you apply all these rules, you arrive at the final form down here, which is like the actual surface form of the root. And we can look like at another one, and you see all these other like different kind of like, so like I'm much more like a language person, so I can give you like a good example of like a linguistic approach, but they're like similarly rigorous approaches to logic. But like this work is like, I always am astounded by like the extent to which this like grammar is like descriptive and complicated at like the time that it was written. So yes, like very rigorous. I'm not sure if that answered your question. Yes?
Oh yeah, that answered my
Okay,
question.
all right, cool. All right, let's quickly do an overview of Indian philosophy. All right, so yeah, so the Indian philosophical tradition, some of it is lost to history, but from what it seems to be, there was this formalization in around 1200 AD by the Vedantins, that there are these 6 Astika schools or orthodox schools that accept the authority of the Vedas, which are a specific text in Indian philosophy. These 6 schools accept that as an authoritative source of information, a source of knowledge, and there are several schools that don't. But the 6 Astika schools are Sankhya, which is basically focused on this idea of like dualism between phenomenological consciousness, right? We sort of talk about phenomenology, so like experience and consciousness, and prakriti, which is like the material world as well as the mental world. So they draw this interesting mind-body duality that like is different from the line that is drawn by like Western philosophers. Then you have the yoga school, which is sort of like Sankhya, but they have like they have an idea of God. Then you have the Nyaya school, which formalized a ton of logic. You have the Navya Nyaya approach to logic, which was developed in like the 1100s, where there's actually a Stanford article called Analytic Philosophy in Early Modern India. And this article is basically about the Navya Nyaya school. They basically developed formal logical approaches to logic that are very similar to the ways that 20th century analytic philosophers went about doing the same thing. So like, yeah, we can get into that later. So that's what the Nyaya school is. Then you have the Vaisheshika school, which is a slightly older school that's focused on ontology. So like, what is the nature of the things we see around us? And they actually developed the idea of atomism, right? That you have like indivisible atoms. This is similar to like Democritus in Greece, right? Democritus also had an idea of atomism going back to like 300, 400 AD. So the Vaisheshika school is sort of like that. You have the Mimamsa school, which I lean to in a lot of ways, which focuses largely on linguistic analysis and the ways that words gain meaning, but like more fundamentally, they have a rigorous approach to, they're very much more focused on action than knowledge. So there's this sort of division between action and knowledge in Indian philosophy. You have the Mimamsakas, who are all about ritual action, but also action on like a societal level. And then you have the Vedantins, who are much more about intellectual pondering of the grand metaphysics of the relationship between like self and the universe, the soul, God, etc. So that's the Vedantin school as well. Then you have the three or more Nastika schools. The most common ones are Bauddha or Buddhism, Jaina or Jainism, and then the Charvaka school. The Charvaka school is very interesting. They were skeptics and they developed a argument similar to Hume's argument. A quick overview of this argument. Actually, I don't want to go into this, but basically they basically say that causality does not exist, and their argument is sort of compelling. And Hume came up with the same argument in like the 1700s. So they're interesting as well. Any questions on any of the ideas I mentioned here with these schools of philosophy? Cool. So these schools, let's take a look at the history of it, right? So before the Vedas, we had the Indus Valley civilization, and we'll go into like the history in the next few lectures. But really, the continuation of like the continuous intellectual tradition of India really starts with the Vedas in around like 1500 to like 1000 BC, which are much more sort of like ritual action focused, but they also have a lot of interesting metaphysics in there, and they're very material focused as well. Which is why I sort of like resonate with them, because they're very materialistic. They're like acquire cows and gold. One of these Vedic verses is literally this dude flexing how much gold he got from his enemies, and I'm like, damn, that's like nothing like the later Hindus. I'm like, that's kind of cool. And then you have the Upanishads, which became much more kind of metaphysical, right? Like, who am I? Like, I am God. I am the universe, etc., etc. Then you have Buddhism and Jainism. You have the Hindu synthesis, which from a historical narrative perspective, we sort of see as like the Hindus, they're losing ground to the Buddhists. The Buddhists are gaining more and more popularity. So the Hindus come up with this Hindu synthesis where they basically adapt a bunch of these Buddhist ideas and turn it into Hindu ideas. So you have like the Bhagavad Gita and a lot of other books written in this period. Then you finally have the Buddhist age, where it turns out the Hindus lost anyway. The Buddhists basically become much more popular, and for a few hundred years, the Buddhists are much more dominant in India than the Hindus are. And then around the 300 AD, you have this revival of Hinduism, and you have the Gupta Empire and the golden age of Indian philosophy, where you have all these schools debating, right? You have like a rigorous form of debate that all these schools adhere by. They go into like all these courts of kings, and they have like rigorous debates, and everything is very cool. There's a lot of cool linguistics that comes out of this period as well. Then you have the Bhakti movement in the 800s AD, which professes this idea of devotion, right? That like all of this intellectualism and ritual is all kind of irrelevant. What really matters is like devotion to God, right? And that's sort of the form of Hinduism that we start seeing today. After the Islamic invasions, you have this Vedantic unification in the last few hundred years, which is this synthesis of like Bhakti ideas of like devotion with the Vedantic ideas of like non-duality of like self and consciousness or God. And that's the form that we as like the Hindu community, I'm sure a lot of you have been like taught by your parents, that you have all these deities like Ganesha and like Vishnu, etc., etc. And all of these are like manifestations of like one fundamental God, and blah, 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 blah. You guys like know vaguely what I'm talking about. But again, Hinduism has changed a lot. and this is sort of just like a highlights reel of the past like 3,000 years of like major developments in the intellectual or religious history of India. Cool. So I totally skipped a slide, I think. Wait, yeah. All right. So what is history? Or first, any questions on this again? Or discussions or points or arguments? Cool. Yeah. So I was sort of just like spewing facts there, I guess. So that's expected. What about what is history? So when I say history, like what does that mean to you? I sort of just gave you a history right here, right? I gave you a history. When I say like a history of like a history of television in 20th century America, right? Like what does history mean? Or when I just say, what is the history of humanity? Or like, what is history? Like what do these words mean? Like, what is, yeah, like, give me an answer. Omer, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry, Julian tried to call me. I'm trying to get him to stop calling me.
Okay. Any answers though otherwise?
I would say it's definitely narrative based. Like we kind of shy away from saying like you kind of just make up a story about the past, but I think like the better histories tend to do a better job of creating like a full narrative that includes like all the facts we know about whatever we're studying.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, right? It's sort of like, how do we construct a narrative or story from the facts that we see? Any other thoughts on what history might be?
I mean,
I feel like it's kind of like seeing the past through someone else's eyes.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, right. Like we never observe the past directly, right? So we sort of have to see it through someone's eyes in order to really understand what's going on. Rohan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that at its core, it's really from my understanding, at least, it's the documentation of events and the subsequent study of that documentation to sort of understand the current and the future.
Yes, that's an interesting opinion, and I call it an opinion because we will dive into why in the next slide. Okay, so narrative versus facts, right? So Nathan sort of touched on this. History. Let's ask this question: What is the purpose of history, right? I'd say that the purpose of history is to provide a story that explains why we are here the way we are. There's a lot of different answers to this, but I've actually heard this idea floated that history was invented in the last couple hundred years. Really, history as a discipline was invented to fuel like the nationalist agendas of Western Europe, and that might have sounded like a pejorative thing, but I didn't mean it in a pejorative way. I'm simply saying that, like, in order to construct a nationalist identity and a national identity, you have to be able to tell a story of the process that identity went through. When you understand yourself, right? Who am I, Rohan, as a 20-year-old male who goes to CMU? All of these things form part of my story that constructs my identity as I am today. So history is really about, at a societal level, how do these broad identities like Americanness or Chineseness or Frenchness, what is the story, the narrative that these identities went through in their lifetime, which then spans hundreds or thousands of years? So that's like one kind of motivation that I think history in the modern sense came from. Nathan?
I kind of disagree with that a little bit. I feel like there are a lot of cultures around the world where, going back way further than 1800s, it's not really history in the sense we have today, of course, but there are a lot of cultures where there's a big importance on like your lineage and being able to, like, for example, in the Arab world, many people will be able to recite their lineage going back many, many generations. And I see that as a form of history and how they kind of construct their own narrative by oftentimes connecting themselves to an important figure like Muhammad in the Islamic world, or like some clan founder in other cultures.
Very true, very true. Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I think you see those kind of sort of lower level abstractions of history happen all over the world. But history in the modern Western sense generally concerns itself with national level happenings, right? So when we ask, what is the history of the United States? There's some uneducated, uncivilized mass of Americas with all these like uncivilized barbarians, right? And then the Europeans show up and they colonize the Americas, and they start making all this money, blah blah blah. Then they have the Revolutionary War, which is all about liberty, right? And this is like the sort of the fire of puberty of the United States, I guess. Like the fuel that like makes it what it is. America is built on what? Liberty, because that's what we are. We revolted against our fathers for, and that's actually a very, like, Freud talks about this too. But like this idea of like revolting against your father, there's actually there's a Vedic verse about this too. I don't want to go into that, but this idea of revolting against your past is what like fuels you, like creates your personal identity, right? And then we have the same thing with the Civil War, right? Again, you have this idea of liberty, right? Liberating the slaves, and it shows up again. And then through the 19th century, what we're going to Germany to what? Liberate the Jews, right? We're free. Omer is like sort of smirking there. yeah. This idea of liberty is the idea of American history then serves to construct this identity of Americanness that's built on liberty, right? So that's sort of what I mean when I say the modern Western conception of history. It's basically a task of constructing a national level identity. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even more so nowadays, it's more about like, it's also national, but it's also global, and trying to piece together into like a whole global narrative, and that can kind of squash the like the individual and more grounded identities that we have.
Exactly. I think that's totally true. And Tanuj asked in chat whether history existed before written documentation. I think sure, like it did in like certain smaller scales of abstraction, right? You have these narratives that Nathan was talking about where like people can recite their like clan history, et cetera, et cetera. But at this broad kind of scale, it doesn't really seem to be the case. So then the question becomes, didn't most civilians in the US not know about the Holocaust during World War II? That's totally possible. But again, right, like this is why it's history. Because now in the 21st century, when we're looking back into history, we talk about it as we went to liberate the Jews, right? Like we're freeing them. And that's that maybe that's not exactly what happened, but that's the way we tell the story. So that's exactly that's a great segue into this like next kind of thing, right? How do we construct a narrative from a series of events, right? The way things happen in the world is very complex, right? Like there's a ton of causes of everything. There's a ton of inputs and there's a ton of outputs. What is the function in between? No one really knows. There's all kinds of things flying around. But how do we construct a narrative from a series of events? It seems like a huge component of that is really just like, what do we think is conducive to fitting into our identity that we want to construct, right? So maybe most Americans didn't know that we were going to free the Jews. Maybe the reason we went to Germany was to like quash a uprising power that would have like destabilized the trading structure of Western Europe. That's probably another component of the reason why we went to war there. But the way we tell ourselves that history, the way we construct that narrative now 100 years later, is that we went for this purpose of liberty, because that's the American ethos. So I'm sort of hammering this point in because narrative and facts are like sort of diametrically opposed, right? It's very hard to construct a narrative when you have a ton of facts at play, when you have these national level happenings that it doesn't really, cause and effect is hard to draw. So is like, here's two questions I'll pose. Is narrative without facts history? And is facts without narrative history? Where on the continuum do we consider history to be? If I tell you a story about, if I tell you a completely made up story about the United States, that the United States like popped into existence because like God willed it to pop into existence, is that a history? If I tell you, if that constructs a meaningful identity, is that history? Yeah, Marilyn?
I'm not sure how to answer that like directly. So I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, so you can stop me if I do. But it's like you mentioned earlier how there's this idea that popped up that like Egypt was surely the creation of aliens. So I feel like that's sort of similar in the way that if you just made up a story about the US popping out because God said so. So I guess in that way it would be history.
Right, it sort of is, right? Like if I construct a convincing narrative that explains like why things are the way they are today, then maybe it is history. Conversely, is there facts without narrative, right? If I just list a ton of facts about like all the events that happened between the years 1776 and 2022, would that constitute a history? Is that history? I don't know. I don't know, right? I don't know why I'm asking this. Like, it's a hard thing to answer, right? Historical methodology is on a continuum, right? We have to. It's very blurry. Like, where are facts and like where is narrative? It's like a balancing game. So then we come to this question of like, did India have indigenous history? A lot of people say no. India doesn't have indigenous history. A lot of people say this, and I used to agree with this, but more and more I'm realizing that narrative and facts both exist independently in actually I wrote these slides when I was of a different opinion. My opinion has sort of changed since I wrote these slides. But like all the important components are here. I guess narrative and facts existed independently in Indian history. So we have facts in the Puranic like the Puranic layer of Indian literature. There are Puranas that talk about like historical annals of specific kingdoms, specific dynasties, et cetera, and you also have like pure narratives, right? That are like, for example, the Raghuvansha, which basically tells a pretty seemingly nonsensical genealogy of a certain dynasty. But I used to think that there's like minimal synthesis, but more and more it seems that there are significant swaths of Indian history across which you can draw pretty well-formed histories. So, for example, the Mahabharata, to many of us, it is like a epic of like legendary proportion. When I say indigenous history, sorry, I mean this to say, does India have a history that is historically written by Indians? Have Indians been able to produce history for like the length of their civilization? There's to frame this slide again, there's like very commonly in Western academia, you will encounter this idea that India was very advanced in a lot of ways, but they never had history, except for this like one guy called Kalhana in Kashmir in the 1100s. But like aside from that, like India never had history. That's like sort of this like common trope that you see in Western academia. But like a sort of approach I'll take in this is that India definitely did have history in a number of different places at different times and on different levels across that narrative fact continuum. It's just a matter of where do you consider the delineating lines on that continuum to be a history. The Mahabharata, yes, I'm sure that no one was ever flying around in a chariot shooting like flaming arrows that exploded into a million pieces. I'm sure that did not happen. But is the broader narrative of a civil war within the Kuru dynasty in like the 10th century BC that resulted in like a significant like dynastic shift, is that possible? I think that's a totally plausible core of this narrative, and that is like an opinion that is like increasingly being taken on by philologists. For a lot of Indian history, for a lot of Western historians of India, they almost only rely upon foreign sources for Indian history. So for example, you have the Greeks who visited India. Do I have a slide for this? No, I don't have a slide for this. You have Greeks who visited India and wrote these chronicles called Indicas. There's an entire genre of Greek literature called like Indicae, where they basically, you have like these travelers that go to the East or like go to Asia and they write about like what they see and blah, blah, blah. There's like 4 or 5 books called Indica by the Greeks. And then you also have the Chinese Buddhist monks who arrive in like the early centuries AD. You actually, and then later on you have like the Islamic, the Islamic Turks and what are they? The Persians who also write about Indian history. And those are the primary sources that the Western historians use to analyze Indian history. But there's other sources from which we can derive history for India. There's Indian diachronic linguistics, which tells us some things, and genetics, blah, blah, blah. And there's also this Indian trope in India. There's also this interesting trope in India where symbols in India gain power from their timelessness. Whereas in the West, it seems like sometimes symbols and structures gain their power from their history, right? From the story that we tell about them. Certain things in India seem to maybe gain their power from the fact that there is no history about them. They have always existed and they have never changed. And maybe that's part of the reason why there's an entirely different approach to history in India. Cool. Any thoughts on this slide or anything I brought up here? Definitely feel free to interject at any point. Like just raise your hand when I'm talking, and I'll totally just pause my rant. Okay. Also for future reference, like I don't think we'll be going to 850 like every class. Maybe just this first class. And yeah, in the future, when we're having, the way I want to structure this class in the future is that we'll have like 30 minutes of discussion and then, 30 minutes of like lecture or probably less. And then we'll have discussion for the rest on like a certain topic. And then whenever you want to leave the discussion, basically you can leave discussion. But for this first class, like since we're sort of going over like the fundamentals that are going to underlie the discussion of the course for the rest of the semester, it's like basically longer. Okay, cool. So what is religion? This is sort of our next big like underlying question that someone was getting at earlier, right? Like what is religion? What is culture? What is philosophy? Like what is the boundary between these? Can someone give examples of religions maybe and what makes them religions? Yeah, Chris.
I think a primary, so some examples of religion like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, like Buddhism, and some other like sects,
Sure.
like Mormonism. So I think the main underlying feature that ties all these like religions together is the fact that there's like some like supernatural belief that's like something that I guess transcends like like our reality in some way that follows these religions like believe, and that's like what underlies these religions.
Yeah, that I think supernatural belief is definitely like one huge component of like what makes a religion a religion. Any other thoughts, Milo?
Like any belief is like I would say faith-based, where like you're believing it not based on like, oh, you're proving it this way or that way, but based on that it's faith. It's on faith.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of opinion, and we'll get into it in our like epistemology, the few weeks we spent on epistemology. But like one quick comment I'll leave on that is like, is it a leap of faith to say that reason is a means to knowledge? Is it not a leap of faith to say that empirical observation yields knowledge about the world? That is like a comment I'll sort of put there. But what is any other thoughts on what religion might be? Rohan?
Yeah, I mean, it's also usually like having to do with like one person's sort of a dictation of what how to achieve some sort of like escape, I guess, usually. So like in Islam, it's the Prophet Muhammad's sort of like talking, or if it's Christianity, it's Jesus, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, very often like religions are based on like cults or around an individual person, definitely. yeah, Nathan and then Omer.
I think religion also has a lot to do with the specific like rituals that are associated with the beliefs, and there's something about the like rituals associated with religions that is different in a way from the like, so to speak, rituals associated with like irreligion. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. You have this recurring theme of seemingly arbitrary rituals, yeah. And then Omer, I think, was raising.
Yeah, I think religion, a big part of it is our solution as humans to questions that we couldn't answer, or kind of more a way to pin blame, oftentimes, on situations that seemed inexplicable or had no immediate reason or logic to them before we could extrapolate ideas for why things happened. We invented this higher being or higher purpose that obviously has more power than us, that we can kind of blame for the wrongdoings and then thank for the good things that we can't explain. So it was kind of this way to pass blame and pass grant off to something that we can't explain.
Yeah, that's also a great answer, right? For a large portion of history, we simply did not have the means, it seems, to like answer a lot of confusing questions about like, why do apples fall to the ground? I don't know, because like Genesis 2 says that God created the earth, and I don't know, like things just fall, right? Like God made it that way, right? So like there's definitely a component of the answer that is like, it is like religion is a great answer to a lot of questions that people had for a lot of history, definitely. Shahzadi?
I think it's also like having like depending on someone, kind of like when you like believe in a god or something, it's to have someone there to turn to. And it's usually for like when you pray or something, it's like to ask for forgiveness or to ask for something better or just to turn to someone to talk to, I think. So it's also like a dependency on someone who's not really there but is technically there for you all the time.
Yeah, definitely. There's like this also like emotional kind of like dependency component that like humans need something to turn to when like shit goes bad, right? And there's actually this like sort of fringe hypothesis called like the bicameral mind hypothesis, which says that for like a lot of human history, humans actually had like two separate parts of their brain, and like everyone was schizophrenic. And basically like when the active half of the brain like suffered like from tough issues or something like that, it would turn to like the other half of the brain and like ask it questions, and the human would like hallucinate like the answers coming in as like extra like weird voices, sort of like a schizophrenic. And like you can search it up, it's very fringe, but like that is sort of a connected kind of idea that would explain why religion and like speaking to God is talked about so much in history, whereas nowadays we don't hear from God, right? Like it's very rare that you hear people talking about like, I heard God tell me to do XYZ. Yes, maybe they ate a funny mushroom, definitely, right? I mean, Moses was smoking on some burning bushes, right? That happened, and he saw a staff turn into a snake, some crazy shit like that. Also in the Vedas, they consumed a substance called soma, and archaeological finds suggest that it might have been hemp or even opium or even ephedrine. There's all kinds of things that it could have been. And the Vedas talk very extensively about this substance. Yeah, cool. A few more things in chats. Yeah, okay, cool. Any other thoughts? Wait, why did we once have this ability? What happened? Oh yeah, Chris, so yeah, you can Google the bicameral mind hypothesis. I personally don't believe it, but it's like there's people in academia who believe it. Cool. Yeah, let's move on. Cool. Is Hinduism a religion? It's blurry, right? Culture versus religion versus philosophy. It's sort of like a spectrum again, right? Where do you draw the line between philosophy, right? Philosophy in a very abstract sense of like rational approach to asking like questions, versus religion, where it's like maybe not rational, but like sometimes it's rational, right? Like people like to say, oh, Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy, because it's like taking sort of a rational approach to these questions. But then you also have all these supernatural things thrown in, and then you also have like rituals thrown in, and then you have like culture where like culture, maybe it's not so much about asking these questions and having these answers, but you have like these rituals and you have these like superstitions, et cetera, et cetera. Comparisons to other religions, right? So like Hinduism, it's pretty clear to most people that it's not a religion in the same way that like Christianity is a religion, right? With Christianity, there's a time that Christianity started, like 0 AD or whatever, or like 30 AD, when like Christ like professed his like his doctrine, and then he gathered a community of like Christians, and they wrote the New Testament. Sure, they were based on an older tradition of Judaism, but Christianity as an idea, the idea that like Christ died for our sins, blah, 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 is rooted in a specific person, and it started at a specific time, and its doctrine was rigorously defined in like the Council of Nicaea in the early centuries AD, and they had all these Christian councils, blah, blah, blah. Hinduism, that never really happened, right? You have this continuous chain of ideas, this intellectual tradition that comes down from prehistory. We have the Vedas, which were composed around 1500 BC, but there's not really a single person there. You have like several sages, and it's more a book of poetry and a formalization of the culture of these people who call themselves the Aryans. But it's not a religion centered. It's not a religion centered around a core doctrine of a few ideas, or it isn't formalized in that way. It's not formalized around a single person. It's not formalized around like a specific creed. And I'll actually present like an opposing view of this later on when I'm in my more pro-Vedic kind of fundamentalist mood. I'll provide like a opposing kind of view to this. But Hinduism seems to more be something like a cultural intellectual tradition, and it sort of seems like Hinduism really only developed as an idea, as a unified idea of religion, once Islam arrived, right? Once you have this opposing something that's different, right, then you start to construct an identity of self. Sort of similar to this philosophical idea that like, if you were the only person in the world, if there were no other humans around, like who would you identify with, right? Like if there was nothing different other than you, like will you still identify like with like yourself? Like it is only when you talk to another person that you realize that like there's another person in the world, right? So like very broad parallel I'm drawing to that, like Hinduism as a unified kind of religion, it's now believed didn't really emerge until the differentiator of Islam arrived in India, and later on like Christianity with the British, et cetera, et cetera. Cool. Oh, wait, are these Aryans different from the Aryans in World War II Germany? Whoops. So sort of, right? So these are the Nazis had their crazy kind of ethnic, ethnocentral, racial supremacist ideas, which were actually they adapted terminology from early 20th century philology, which I can talk about for days. But there are different Aryans, but the Nazis thought they were the same Aryans, but like no, it's like a completely different thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we talked about otherness, right? The ayajyu, this is a term that the Vedas actually use to describe the people who do not sacrifice. It means like which is like negation of like yajju, like the people who sacrifice. So like that's like a delineator of like the other people who are not us, the Vedic people, the Aryans. And then you also have Buddhism, and then like more importantly with our modern form, our modern rendition of Hinduism really only became concretized with this otherness of Islam that arrived. How do my keyboard is terrible. Okay, all right. People who sacrifice what, like animals or worldly goods or something? It's a very specific, so yaj, this root over here, refers to a very specific form of sacrifice called yajna, which we can talk about later as well. It is a fire sacrifice where there are many different types of yajnas. Some sacrifices might have involved animals. Most sacrifices involved like milk. I don't want to go into the details, but like it is a specific. I said a few minutes ago that like the Vedas don't have a specific creed, but in a sort of way, the Vedas are a lot more coherent as a single ideological doctrine than like if you take Hinduism as a whole, because they have this sort of idea of like those who do not sacrifice and a sort of systematized process of sacrifice. Cool. Okay. What is a nation? All right, Tanuj, yeah.
This isn't too much of like a cohesive question, but like if you take a religion, let's say like Hinduism or Buddhism or something, and you take the devotion to the god out of it and the worship out of it, is it still, you know, a religion, or like at what point is it not anymore?
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase like what I'm trying to get at here as well, right? Like if you strip away the rituals and like the supernaturalism, do you get to philosophy? And if you strip away like the metaphysical beliefs and all of that, do you get to like culture? Like, I don't know, right? It's like a continuum. So these things are very blurry. And the reason I brought up this idea of the blurriness of Hinduism is because we are over the course of this semester, we're going to be looking at Indian philosophy, which sort of blurs with Hinduism in some senses, but it's also in its own sense something that many Hindus are completely unfamiliar with. I'd definitely be comfortable saying that 95% of Indian philosophy is completely foreign to the average Hindu. Yeah. So okay, cool. I'm not sure if that answered your question. I don't know, right? Like that's sort of the purpose of asking the question. Like it's basically blurry. That's the only way I can put it. Cool. What is a nation? What is a nation? We sort of talked about like nations and history already a bit. But any thoughts on like what makes a nation a nation? Nation is used in a lot of different ways, but like, does anyone know the etymology of the word nation? Does anyone speak Spanish or French or Latin maybe?
It's related to birth, right?
Yes, it is related to birth. Oh, there's some weird Zoom stuff, sorry. Yeah, it is related to birth, right? So Spanish nacer, Latin nacere means to like be born, and it's actually cognate with the Sanskrit root janati, which means to be born. And I don't know if anyone speaks Hindi, but like you have a lot of words like jana. Oh, the word jana, right? Like means like man.
I think janam is birth, right?
Jana means birth, right? And that's actually cognate with the word nation. Nation in Latin is nacere, but it comes from, or like nascere, something like that. But it comes from like Old Latin gnascere, but then they drop the G. It sort of sounds like this is hand wavy stuff, but it's not. Like I'm not capping right now. This is also related to English nascent, yes. Here, let's pull up the etymological. Oh my god, entry for the word nation. Yo, what is going on right now? I think my laptop just cannot handle Zoom. Okay, here, etymology. I love doing this. I read etymologies for days. Does anyone know the etymology of etymology? Guesses? Okay, yes, gnatio, right? Which is from this Proto-Indo-European word, genftis. And if you look over here, you have jati, right? You have Latin gens, etc., etc. Cool. I didn't want to that is sort of relevant to the point I'm making here. But again, right, nation is about birth, right? So originally nation referred to this idea of a people who are born together. Yeah, other thoughts on like what is a nation? We only have like a couple slides left, so like we're doing perfectly on time right now. What makes a nation a nation? How do we use nation nowadays? Like when we heard the term the nation of Croatia in media, like what does that mean?
I guess just like a sovereign body under one kind of unified government with borders.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
Yeah,
that's the way it's used nowadays. and it's sort of like a semantic shift, right? Nation is nowadays very interchangeable with the terms like state or country, but like historically, the idea of nation is very intertwined with ethno-national ideology, right? The French nation is the French people, right? Originally, it meant something a lot more similar to literally French people. Like the nation of France was the French people who speak the French language and identify with Frenchness. And what did Frenchness mean? Frenchness basically meant the national identity that evolved over history that French historians constructed. And it probably was the French national ethos is like liberté, égalité, fraternité, like, right? We learned this in like AP Gov or whatever. And so nationhood is based on this idea of like common birth. And later on, you have this idea of like civic nationalism, that maybe nationhood isn't just based on being of the same ethnicity, but it's maybe based on having the same ideas, having the same culture. And then eventually you arrive at the state where nationality is very secularized, right? It's stripped of all of its cultural and ethnic implications, and becomes entirely a term that refers to a secular government state border with territories. But that like historically is not the case. I like the cat on, who is this? Is that Tanuja's screen? Whose cat is that? I like this cat. Let us take a moment to admire this cat. Yes, this is a very nice cat. Okay, wonderful. So does India have a historically unitary identity? Does, bruh. Oh, okay, wait. I'm sorry. Okay, all right, let's talk about this first. More Western social categories. Do ethnicity and race exist in India? Can someone who is Indian maybe tell me whether ethnicity exists in India? And can someone tell me whether race exists in India? Or
yeah, I'd like to add some. So yeah, I would say ethnicity exists. I am Tamil, so I'm South Indian, and I think that would be my ethnicity. I wouldn't think that Indian is my ethnicity. Race, I'm not sure exists, because India was invaded many times by different groups of people, and racially, I think we're mixed. So yeah.
Right? Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think ethnicity exists in some sense. And I'd sort of argue that ethnicity is more of a modern construct of the last few hundred years. Historically, it seems that people would not say that like I am Tamil, but they'd instead say like I speak Tamil, right? It's not a entirely it was, what I'll say instead is that there are different axes along which people identify, right? If anyone here is like familiar with if anyone here has taken machine learning, right? You or like other like kind of data analysis classes, you know that like you can have multiple axes along which your data sits, right? And some of these axes have more variance than others. And you can run something called a PCA, principal component analysis, which basically identifies the most relevant features that help people distinguish themselves from one another. Basically, that's a complex way of saying that there are different categories along which people identify, and at different points in history and different places in the world and in different cultures, there are like certain categories are more important than other categories. So I'd sort of argue that historically, certain other categories were more important in Indian society. So you have like Bhasha, which means like language, and that has historically been sort of important, but like at least in the intellectual class for most of Indian history, they spoke some form of Sanskrit. You also have Gotra, which means like patrilineal clan, which has been like an important sort of like identity marker for a lot of Indian history, at least in certain classes. And then you also have Jati and Varna, which are a conglomeration of like what is now referred to as caste. And it seems like for a lot of Indian history, those were like the primary delineators by which people identified themselves. There is only one race, the human race. Indeed. we are all African because humans came from Africa. Yes, I like this answer. I like this answer. But like on like a semi-serious note, like, yeah, I mean, I don't know what I was gonna say, but yes, like race is a social construct in many ways. There are also like genetic correlates of race, but like the clusters of like blackness and whiteness in the U.S. that race is the race sort of originally served to identify blackness and whiteness as ideas or fundamental social delineators don't really exist in India, and that's sort of what we mean when we say race doesn't exist in India. So like I'd argue that race is like a major social category that emerged in the Americas, and ethnicity is like a major social category that emerged in Europe. So while Europeans were delineating themselves based on these linguistic identifiers, right, like Frenchness, Germanness, and forming these nation states, America was like a unified kind of nation with like multiple races that inhabited it. And this is like also like a product of globalization in like the 1800s, where Europeans were going out and realizing like, wow, there are like some people out there who are like really different, or at least like look really different. Yeah. Does India have a historically unitary identity? Does India, or another way to put this, does India exist as a nation? Is there a nation of Indians? And can anyone draw any comparisons to other nations that we know, for the most part, do exist, right? Or other regions, right? So like Frenchness, I think we can pretty fairly say like Frenchness, like France exists as a nation. There's an idea of Frenchness that a lot of French people identify with. China, there's also this idea of the Han race, right? Which is actually a product of the last 100-ish years. There's a very interesting essay out of Harvard that like talks about like the construction of the Han race. And the CCP has done a very good job, and like the Chinese like nationals in like the early 1900s have done a very good job of like constructing national identity in China, which historically might not have existed. But yeah, does India have a historically unitary identity? Like, what do you guys think? Like, has an Indian nation existed for a lot of history? For most of history? Yashika?
I feel like just by the nature in which India existed, which is just a bunch of really separate kingdoms that were really governing themselves. And once in a while, you know, someone would come in from the outside and conquer like a bunch of those kingdoms. For that reason alone, I don't think India has an identity as India as a whole. I don't think that identity existed until really 1947, when India gained its own sovereignty as its own nation. And even now, if you go to India again, like it is pretty divided. People will, like, even within India, if you were to ask someone, where are you from? They wouldn't say India. They would probably list off like all these different geographical locations. And I don't know, for that reason, I feel like India has never really been one nation.
Yes, this is the answer I was looking for. Anyone else? Okay, cool. So it's the answer I'm looking for, in the sense that like a portion of this class is like my presentation of an argument that like this is actually not true. That an Indian nation actually does exist, and there is a core to Indian identity, which is like based in certain form, in a certain class of literature, like Sanskrit literature, and certain religious or cultural traits that are founded in the Vedas. And I'll make this argument over the course of this semester, basically saying that yes, there were tons of kingdoms, right? There were tons of foreign powers, et cetera, but what is a nation about, right? A nation is not about who rules you. It is about identity, right? So what I would be comfortable saying is that an Indian state has not existed for a lot of history. Sure, you have periods of unification like the Maurya Empire and the Gupta Empire, but an Indian nation, a nation and a national identity built upon a shared foundation of the Vedic form of literature, Sanskrit as an intellectual language, and a shared intellectual history, I will make the argument in this class that does exist. And there's other ways we can look at this argument as well. You have geographic descriptions in the Puranas that basically describe the entirety of like the Indian subcontinent, but like not too much beyond that. You also have like use of Sanskrit across India as like a as a like language of intellectualism, even in Tamil Nadu, where you don't have where like in recent years there's like been more like independent like nationalism. Even in Tamil Nadu, all the great philosophers have used Sanskrit, as well as Tamil, definitely. So next slide will be about Vedas and decentralization. This is sort of like more hammering in like this argument that I'm going to put forth in this class. Sure, the religion is pluralist. There's a lot of Hindus with like differing ideas, but like if you ask like the average Hindu, like where like what is like the document that like defines Hinduism, most of them will say like Vedas, right? Like they don't know what it means, but like they're like yeah, the Vedas are like some authoritative like source of like knowledge. Politically, yes, right, there are many separate entities that came up, right, all these different kingdoms, etc. But they all sort of recognize like this central Vedic identity. If not the rulers, definitely the people inhabiting it were fundamentally like Vedic. And socially, they're divided into all these groups, right? There's all these gotras and jatis that are like known as like castes, etc., etc. But there's like a central like Vedic identity that was like acknowledged by all these classes, that like regardless of what a person's class is, they'd still like follow like the same basic set of rituals or ideas. And on a linguistic dimension, all the languages in North India descend from Sanskrit, and like basically all the languages in South India borrow very heavily from Sanskrit. In fact, like Telugu has a higher percentage of like Sanskrit words than like even Hindu does, despite Telugu not even being a Indo-Aryan language. So this is sort of a argument I will put forth in this class, and I strongly encourage you to like try to poke holes in my argument and put forth differing opinions. But sort of the project of this of part of this class will be for me to try to convince you guys that there is a central national identity of India that has existed for several thousand years. Cool. So we're doing perfectly on time. Any thoughts on this first? Any on anything I said previously? Anyone want to poke any holes or ask questions right now? Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely have a lot more time to discuss this kind of stuff later on.
Super short question. Is this the Zoom link for each week?
Yes, this is going to be the Zoom link for like this week and next week. It seems pretty likely that we are going to be going back in person after that. I've heard that from the SUCO supervisors themselves, so I'm pretty confident it's going to happen. But yeah, we'll be using the same Zoom. And the Canvas should also be published. You might have to go in like your courses section specifically and like add it to the main thing. There's not going to be too much on Canvas. Let's actually talk about that right now. So thoughts on class structure. So we're definitely going to be having a lot of discussions. The way this is working is I can pull up like the sort of curriculum I have. So we have this introduction that we went through. We're going to do like next week, we're going to be talking about history, historical evidence in India, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to be looking at archaeology, genetics, all these different kind of dialectics in a Hegelian sense. We're also going to be looking at like a political timeline. And then we'll do a week on Sanskrit, and we'll talk about like linguistics and cool stuff like that. We'll do a week on literature, lots of interesting literature. We'll be talking about the Kama Sutra as well, which I know some of you guys are definitely hyped to learn about. And then we're also going to see some like very cool stuff like the Shishupala Buddha, which has some crazy, like look up the Wikipedia page for this. It's absolutely wild. Yes, Chris, this Sanskrit is like the language that like a lot of Indian languages are based off of, and it's drawn on by a lot of things. You also have, then after that, we're going to dive into like the 7-week core of this class. The first week is going to be ethics, sociopolitics, and aesthetics. I'm sure this is going to be a very, very inflammatory discussion, or at least a very contentious discussion where we talk about caste system, and we might talk about other stuff as well. Then we have 6 weeks which are based on the textbook. I'm not going to require readings per se, but it'll make discussions a lot more interesting if you guys do the readings. But regardless, I'm going to do like a 20 to 30 minute lecture at the start of each of these classes to give like a broad overview of each of these topics, so that everyone is like roughly on the same footing before we jump into the content. Then we'll have like a week on religion. After going over all this stuff, maybe we'll be able to have a more productive kind of discussion about like what religion is and like what like the centrality of like the Vedas, etc. again. And then we'll have like a fun couple of weeks of music, dance, art, and then like math, astronomy, architecture to finish off the semester. So that's the way I'm planning on structuring the class right now. I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on the I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on this. Do you think I should make readings mandatory? Do you think I should do like pop quizzes or something? Do you think I should introduce like a short paper? I did want to include some kind of closing kind of project at the end, and I'd love for you guys to like float suggestions of what that project might look like. Yeah, any thoughts on this, guys?
What are the kind of structured like, and what are they like? I'm assuming it's a textbook, so it's like secondary, tertiary sources.
Yeah, so the textbook is like it's not a history textbook. It's a very rigorously like philosophy textbook, or a very strictly kind of philosophy textbook. It does talk a bit about like the history of these schools, etc. But it is a textbook that is broken down in the exact same way that like my curriculum is broken down, in terms of it has like 7 core chapters, 3 on epistemology, 3 on metaphysics, and then like 1 on like ethics. So like you guys can like do readings from there if you want, but like more relevantly, my question is like, do you guys want to be quizzed on that for your own kind of sake of knowledge, or do you guys want to change up the way I'm doing these lectures? Do you want to have more discussion?
I think rather than having like strict mandatory readings, which are kind of hard to police anyways, one thing that at least the parts of high school that I enjoyed, it might not be shared amongst other people, but like if you come to class after even having like skimmed the reading or whatever, but writing some like just like a couple of like thought-provoking questions, I think that usually helps carry the discussion when there's either like an awkward pause or something like that, and it's some way that people can participate.
Yeah, what do other people think about that? I like that idea a lot. Because originally I was sort of thinking like people would do like readings or like semi-optional readings, and then they'd come to class and I'd like put out like some kind of quiz. But I think that's a much better way to do it, right? Because if the central goal of this class is to facilitate discussion and engagement with the ideas, I think if we have questions like you guys write like a couple of questions that you think might be interesting to discuss, that might make it a lot more fluid. And yeah. What do you guys think? I see a couple nods. Any strong thoughts on whether we shouldn't do questions, like 2 or 3 questions that you'd be expected to just like bring into class? I'm obviously not going to check you guys on this. I don't think, like, I'm not going to like go around and be like, did you write your questions? But like, it's sort of going to be evident from the discussion, I imagine. Okay, cool. I think, all right, cool. It seems like a lot of people are on board with this. And then what about in terms of like a semester closing kind of project? Do you guys want to do like a short essay? Like, I feel like I don't want this to be an essay in the sense of like, go cite all these sources, write like 500 words bullshit. Like, I want it to be like an interesting kind of synthesis of ideas that like you might be interested in, right? So like Max is like a math major. Maybe he'll take some ideas he knows in math and like relate it to some kind of like interesting ideas that like we talk about in like the lecture on math. I don't know, like what do you guys think about that? Like, is an essay a good way to do some kind of like semester closing project, or do you guys have something else in mind? Okay, cool. I see a couple nods. If anyone feels strongly against like not wanting to write an essay, I guess like we can come up with like alternative like final assessments. I'm just like required as like a Stuco to like have some kind of like final assessment, and I think like some kind of synthesis or like connection with your own kind of identity is like a great way to do that, or at least like a way I'd enjoy doing that. And I'm really interested to like read something like that from all you guys too. So yeah, I mean, I'll how about this? Like we'll say like that's the default, but like if you guys want to do like yeah, showcasing some kind of intersection with something you're interested in individually. That's really okay.
You could even kind of leave it like open, whether someone wants to either write an essay, or for some people who might want to like give it in like a presentation form, or whatever you want to do. I like the idea of like, you know, if you like math or chess or whatever, tying it to this class. I like that as a concept. Pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. So I guess we can do it something like that. Final project would sort of basically be some kind of something that like showcases the intersection between the class and like something you're interested in individually. And then if you want to do something else, if you have a completely different idea, that's also completely chill. Just like talk to me about it beforehand, like float the idea to me, and yeah, we'll explore it together. Cool. I don't want to go too much over time. Thank you guys for all listening. This was a super interesting discussion. I think we got a lot of great participation from just about everyone. So it was really interesting hearing everyone's opinions. Thank you so much for showing up again today to class. Hopefully after next week, we're going to be in person again. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan.
Thank you.